Now, rather than trying to understand the physiology of the brain and all the different sections, it can be a little bit complicated to understand. I think it's a lot simpler if we just look at a simple model or an analogy of the mind that can make it a lot easier to understand. And I think the simplest model was the one proposed by Freud, who said that your unconscious mind is basically divided into what he called the id and the superego, and then he called this section in between the ego, which is the part that's constantly trying to balance the often conflicting needs of the id and superego. Now, the id is the part that we would nowadays understand is really being driven by those inner, more primitive parts of the brain. Okay, the id thinks very much like a young child, okay, just wants to be loved and accepted and sort of fit in with a family type of group environment. The id doesn't really think much about anybody else or think about any other part of time, can kind of worry about the future but not necessarily be very good at planning for it, can kind of be depressed about the past but not necessarily be very good at being able to get over it, can worry about what other people think of it but not necessarily be able to exercise empathy or understand other people's feelings very well. Basically, you could call this section of the mind the inner child. Okay, sort of thinks like a 5, 6, maybe 7-year-old child. Now, the thing about the inner child is that it also, its role is it's in charge of, I guess, what you'd call your identity. Okay, the inner child has this list titled cans, and anything that's on that list are the things that you feel that you can do with ease. These are the things that you feel that you are confident in being able to do. The things that are on that list are the things that you could do without having to struggle or try or feel any resistance against, okay? But the things that are not on that list are the things that your inner child mind would feel are foreign or unfamiliar. The things that are not on that list of cans are the things that it would feel are beyond its identity and instead part of maybe that tribe over there that those people can do that are sort of not here on our side. Got to remember that, our species as we have existed in our current form have been around for over 200,000 years, and yet modern civilized societies only existed for about 6,000 years, which means that for around about 194,000 years or so, human beings have basically just existed as these very tribal animals. Okay, and so that sort of tribal instinct of who's over there, who's on our side, who's against us, those parts of our identity are really, really important and we often take them for granted. So when you first try to do things that are not on that list of cans, things that you don't feel confident with, that's why you're going to feel that sort of sense of resistance or magnetic repulsion at first. Now, if you were to look at your inner child's list of cans, okay, the things that your inner child feels that it is confident in doing without having to struggle. If the things on that list include things like healthy relationships with people, okay, healthy relationships with your parents, with your siblings, with friends, with your partner, with your children, with your co-workers, that's wonderful, okay? If on your inner child's list of cans, the things that are within your identity include certain, healthy, productive habits and behaviors, healthy relationships with diet and exercise. Again, these are all the things that, if they're on your inner child's list of cans, the things that you feel confident in being able to do, that's fantastic. However, if some of those things are not necessarily on your list of cans, then they're some of the things that you need to get on your list of cans. The problem, though, is in overcoming that initial resistance that may stop you from being able to achieve that. So the lesson here is that if you want to make a change on the inside, the unconscious level, essentially what you need to aim to do is to create a change to your identity. In fact, if you ever watch interviews with people who have struggled with being overweight their entire life, okay, and then somewhere in their adult life they've lost all the weight, they've gotten down to a healthy body weight, if they're being open and honest, one of the things that you'll most commonly hear them say is that they feel like they kind of don't know who they are anymore, or they may even say that they feel that they don't deserve to be that person.
When you looked in the mirror, what did you see?
I saw somebody that didn't know who they were. All my life I was this monster in my head, and all of a sudden to be, this good-looking guy, it blew my mind away. I didn't know how to deal with it.
And so, as a result, they often end up just falling back into their old patterns, their old habits, their old behaviours. In fact, despite all the plethora of dietary interventions and weight loss programs out there, many hundreds of which have been scientifically studied, many of them have been found to be able to get the weight off, but to this day, not one single approach has been scientifically proven to help keep the weight off long term. Okay, because none of them, they all deal with eating and diet and exercise, but none of them deal with the unconscious issues. They don't deal with changing the person's identity. So the message that I'd really like you to take on board here is that if you want to make a serious change, a long-term, a permanent change to your life, you need to create a change to your identity. You need to make sure that your inner child now has that thing on its list of cans. So that way it will be magnetically driven to do those things so that you get to the point where you just couldn't see yourself any other way. In fact, if you were to think back to that old problem that you used to be stuck on, that I mentioned in the previous session, isn't it true that at the time it felt like you could never see yourself as being the kind of person able to do that thing which you are now able to do? And so when you think about that particular part of you, isn't it true that it almost feels like that part of you has had a sort of identity shift? Massive mistake most people fall into the trap of making is that they focus too much on what they don't want. They focus on the problem. They can come along and say, look, this is the thing that I'm doing and I wished I could stop doing this thing, or this is the problem and that I hate this part of me. But the trick is firstly to focus instead on what you do want. So I'll respond by saying, okay, well, if that's the problem, if that's the thing that you don't want, if that was no longer a problem, what would you be doing instead? What is the thing that you do want? Okay, and then the second step is to specifically frame it to focus on not just the thing that you want to be able to do, but how doing that thing would be factored into your identity. So for example, if you come along and said, look, the problem is I keep getting into these bad relationships. Okay, well, first step is to reframe it by saying, all right, what I would like to do is to get into healthy relationships. But secondly, most importantly, is to think of it as I would like to become the kind of person who gets into healthy relationships, or I would like to become the kind of person who has a healthy relationship with diet and exercise habits, or I'd like to become the kind of person that has productive work habits that can be more successful. I'd like to become that person who can do those things that is the opposite of the problem that I don't want, if that makes sense. Because when you feel confident, not only being able to do those things, but being the kind of person that can do those things with such ease that you simply couldn't see yourself any other way, that's when you'll know you've had an identity change. And when you've had an identity change, that's when those internal magnets will stop resisting against the things that you want to do and instead start automatically drawing you towards those things, so you don't need to struggle. You don't need to rely on motivation and willpower. You don't even need to try.
A simple way to think of the unconscious mind is that your inner child maintains a list of cans, which are things it feels confident being able to do. That combined list creates your identity, driven by the more primitive parts of the brain which came in handy for our early tribal ancestors. Most people's attempts at change fail eventually because they don't aim to change their unconscious identity. To change your identity, you need to get to the point where you simply couldn't see yourself any other way. When that happens, you'll be magnetically drawn towards the change you've come here looking for without even having to try. The journey to becoming the person you want to become will be met with internal resistance, however, which most people don't know how to get past. In the next few lessons, however, Stuart will show you exactly what creates that resistance and, most importantly, he'll show you the simple loopholes to sneak around it and to build your confidence to become the person you really want to become.